Everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just 1 minute. You should see a survey on your screen. If you could please complete that as you join the webinar. Good morning. I'm seeing many people join the webinar this morning. There's a survey on a screen, a pop-up screen in front of you. If you could please complete that as you join. Good morning. There's lots of us joining this webinar today. Thank you for being here. Please, as you join, fill out the survey in front of you on your screen. And we'll get started in just a minute. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. As more of you join the webinar, just want to remind you to please fill out the survey that's in front of you. All right, as people continue to join in the next couple of minutes, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a really incredible agenda today, and so I want to get you to the heart of our training together. My name is Linan Gutierrez, and I'm the Assistant Director at Groundwork Ohio. Groundwork Ohio is the statewide nonpartisan early childhood policy research and advocacy organization in the state of Ohio. Our mission is to champion early learning and healthy development strategies in the prenatal to age 5 period of life to support children, families, and communities. And again, thank you so much for joining us. There's more of you popping on. If you could just complete the survey that's in front of you. I want to share just briefly why we're doing this webinar. We know that the evidence of systemic racism has been abundant, longstanding, and indisputable in our country and state. And this past summer, once again, had been made clear by the senseless and dehumanizing death of George Floyd. And as we honor the lives of those who've been killed and the many more who have felt threatened, less than, or forgotten as a result of systemic and individual biases, we as an organization and staff recognized and renewed our obligation to do better. And we shared a number of resolutions we made in the letter to our network of stakeholders and policymakers with grace and humility, with an invitation to join us and challenge us as we act on these resolutions. And we'll share that letter with you in the chat box if you're interested in reading the full letter. But one of our commitments was to use our position at Groundwork and our influence to unapologetically advance conversations around race and dismantle discriminatory policies. And as we were responding to the crises of the pandemic, particularly among the childcare system, there were countless examples of how the racial justice movement, even the protest activity itself, was directly impacting early childhood systems here in Columbus, where we're based, and across the state. And as we brought together diverse stakeholders to solve problems, we were again reminded how important a common language and framework of understanding of equity and the impact of systemic racism is to advancing our mission. And so we knew we needed to act on this need for early childhood professionals, and are happy to bring with our partners this training to you here today. So as with all of our work, we could not do this on our own. We thank our partners for the opportunity to co-host this training alongside them. We identified and shared the same challenges and came together to plan this opportunity as a way to renew our commitment to advancing equitable outcomes for young children together. And no one of us can do it alone. And so while we come with unique missions to this work, we're unified behind ensuring that every child and family in Ohio has what they need to grow and thrive in our communities. So thank you to the Ohio Association for the Education of Young Children, Thank you to OCALI. These are advocates for people with disabilities across the life course. To the Black Child Development Institute in Cleveland. We're lucky to have an affiliate of the National Institute here in Ohio. Thank you to the YWCA of Dayton, Ohio, and thank you to Learn to Earn in Dayton, Ohio, Dayton's Cradle to Career organization. We're so grateful you've joined us today, and we hope to learn more from you about how we can support you in leading for equity and ultimately advancing equitable outcomes for young children. To that end, we view this webinar training as a beginning and not an end. Our partners will be meeting after this webinar to evaluate the training and your feedback to determine what next steps each of us may take to continue and act on the dialogue today. In order to do that, we ask that you'll complete a survey that will be sent via email to you after this webinar has concluded, and I'll remind you again of that at the end of the training. A few notes on housekeeping before we get into the training. You're automatically muted and your video is turned off. So that you should see me, but I can't see you. There will be opportunities for engagement throughout the webinar, but please feel free to use the chat box for any additional questions or insights. We welcome that, and we'll share the chat box among all of our partners to be able to, again, to identify what next steps may be. If you indicated that you'd like to receive professional credit for participating in this training, so you could be a child care professional or an early educator, an early intervention professional, or a social worker, we're offering this webinar at no cost, of course, and have also gone through the process with your professional institutions to ensure that this training is approved for credit. So if you fall into one of those categories, please be sure to stay on for the full webinar and fill out the survey and the follow-up email from Groundwork Ohio later this morning to ensure that you receive credit. And with that, I'm going to turn things to our incredible presenters today, who are nationally recognized as early childhood experts and for their leadership in advancing equity for young children, families, children and families through early childhood systems. First, I'll introduce Michelle Silver-Wright, who is the Build Initiatives Research and Evaluation Manager. Michelle is also on the faculty of Build's Equity Leaders Action Network, working with leaders from across the country, acting on specific racial inequities in state early childhood systems, so in early learning, health, mental health, nutrition, and family supports, and especially at the intersection of these systems. She currently leads Build's evaluation and documentation efforts, conceptualizing, implementing, and sharing results to inform Build's early childhood systems development work and the broader systems development field. Michelle received her BA in sociology with a concentration in women's studies from Drake University and earned her master's in sociology from Iowa State University. We also are pleased to have Dr. Aisha Ray with us. She is a distinguished fellow at the Build Initiative, where she co-leads the Equity Leaders Action Network, a national leadership program. Her Build work focuses on racial equity, teaching and learning, and professional development. In addition, Dr. Ray is part of the Build team working with the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance. She is also a professor emerita of child development at the Erickson Institute. She's a developmental psychologist with an interest in how social, cultural, and racial factors shape early childhood teacher preparation in the workforce, child rearing in low-income Black communities, and the role of fathers, and racial equity and the elimination of white supremacy in early childhood systems. Dr. Ray earned her doctorate and a master's degree in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and a master's degree in early education from the Erickson Institute at the Loyola University of Chicago, and a bachelor's degree in history from Grinnell College. Thank you, Michelle and Dr. Ray, for all your work and support and preparation for today's training, and please take it away.
Thank you, Lynn-Ann. I hope people can hear me. Shake your heads. Yes, okay, good. That means I hope the audience can also hear us. Good morning to everyone. And Michelle and I are really excited to be here and to be able to talk with all of you about what it means to lead for equity and to try to really lift our field in significant ways so that we make a much more significant contribution to the development of children, particularly those children who are racially and economically marginalized in our society and within the state of Ohio. Today, we're going to talk about kind of the parameters of racial equity, what it means to do racial equity work, and particularly focus on the role of leaders and leadership in this. And when we talk about leaders,
Aisha, you've muted yourself. can you unmute? Oh, I don't know if someone muted Aisha or if she can unmute herself. Oh, there you go.
It's not, the slides are not advancing, which is a bit of a problem, but I will keep talking. Nope. Okay. We are, there's our little girl. She is welcoming all of you, and really to us represents the kind of joy and happiness we want to see on every child's face. And particularly, again, those children who, because of the way our society works and functions, which is essentially in a way that does not benefit all children, we really want to make sure that every child looks as healthy, happy, and cheerful as this little girl does. We want to focus just for a moment on this quote from Cesar Chavez, because it really captures a fundamental reality of what racial equity work should do. And that is, it is a social change effort. It is an attempt to change the society in ways that make it better and easier for children and families to thrive. And he captures, I think, some fundamental realities of social change. He says, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. These are our lovely photos. And we also, of course, are including all of you in this webinar and want your input. So there is a chat box. We hope that as we go through this, the webinar content, that you will participate by typing into the chat box your reactions, your questions, your thoughts. We hope at the end of this webinar to have a little bit of time left to talk, to respond to some of your concerns and questions. We are from the BUILD initiative. BUILD has been active as a supporter of Ohio's early childhood systems leadership for a very long time. Currently, BUILD is involved both with early childhood systems leaders, but also with the hub capacity building work of the National Collaboration on Infants and Toddlers. Next slide, please. As we go through this morning together, we hope you will think about these questions. In my current role and responsibilities and influence, do I use equity processes and practices to reduce disparities and increase child and family well-being for those most marginalized? Do I know who is and is not benefiting from my state's and counties' policies and programs? Do I know if our programs, practices, and policies are hurting families or communities? Do I consistently listen to and work with individuals, families, and communities who may use our programs to understand if they are benefiting from them? Am I intentionally working to break down segregation by race and class and increase opportunities so that children, families, and communities thrive and succeed? And do I consistently use data disaggregated by race, social class, gender, and other factors associated with inequality to guide my work? The goals of our webinar are to understand why racial equity matters for Ohio's urban and rural children furthest from opportunity, to understand the fundamentals of a racial equity process and why it can support leaders' efforts to remove racial disparities, to understand how leaders can build personal skills and essential for racial equity work, and to understand how leaders can advance racial equity through building transformative engagement with families and community leaders. We want to look at who is here. You were asked to respond to the poll, and I was looking at the chat as this was beginning and noting that a number of people were having challenges doing this, but that's okay. We will go with the data we have at the moment. So 67% of people currently who have not added to the poll yet are from early care and education, 11% early intervention, and then followed by home visiting, health and mental health, a few folks from public health, family support, child welfare, food and nutrition, and cross systems work. Welcome to all of you. It is terrific to see that there really is cross-system representation at this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to fill that out. As we talk today, Michelle and I are going to raise, and I'm sure many of you are thinking about some really challenging issues that have to do with poverty and inequality. And in this webinar, we want you to think about some agreements that we feel help us keep an open mind and an open heart to what we are going to discuss. We want you to come as a learner and not as an expert, to look for what challenges you're thinking, not for what confirms what you already believe or think is right. We want you to expect that there will not necessarily be closure at the end of this. We want you to trust in others' contributions, respect the way other people think and know the world, and be responsible to the group and for each other, and to listen carefully to one another. This is particularly important if we have the opportunity to have conversation at the end. So I'm going to now ask you to think about something that Michelle and I and our colleagues who do this equity work always ask people to do, and that's to think about your why. Why do you do this work? Knowing what your why is an important part of the work that one does, particularly around equity, because we need to understand what's motivating us. Because of the nature of the racial pedagogy that many of us in the United States, if not all of us in the United States, have learned by living in this country. In other words, we've learned to think about race in particular ways because of the way the society organizes and supports race and racism. So why people come to this work is really important. So we would like you to watch this video, and then we're going to ask you a question.
This is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know, the next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what, the key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So Break Time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, can you sing? And then I'm just gonna show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a like me. Right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose.
So I hope that that video was inspired you to think about your own why. So please write into the chat, why are you doing the work that you're doing for young children and families in Ohio? You just share that with us. I think everyone will be able to see your responses. Part of the reason we use this clip is because it really makes the case, I think, in a very lovely way, a very powerful way, that what we do is far less important in many ways than what motivates us to do it. When you think about, for example, how people lead, we really lead by inspiring others, not simply by telling them what they need to do, but because of our example, because of what moves us, we are able to move people, even when we don't have a lot of authority over individuals. And if you think about someone like Dr. King, remember that he said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a plan. So I'm going to hand this over to my dear friend, Michelle, as you write your thoughts about what moves you. And she is going to talk with us about Ohio's children and families right now in the midst of COVID-19.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aisha. I'm gonna move.
Michelle?
Yeah.
If I could, I noticed the answers are lagging a little. I just want to remind folks that we'll be using this poll throughout their training, and you need to go to www.menti.com, and you can either access that on your smartphone or on the computer you may be using for this Zoom call, and then you'll be prompted to enter the code. I know I can see a lot of you figure that out. I just wanted to be clear that that'll be used throughout the webinar, so just want to make sure folks are able to participate. Thanks, and I'll disappear again. Thank you.
Oh, no, you're good, that's great. So can I, Lynanne, can I move on to the next slide, or do we need to keep this up?
Well, yeah.
You can move on,
Okay,
but that'll be saved for us, and we can share that again.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, trying to advance to the next slide. I'm getting a lag with the advancing. All right, so this will come as no surprise to anyone, and Lynanne and Aisha have both mentioned it already in the introduction part of our comments today, but clearly we are in an extraordinary period in history. We're in the middle of a pandemic. That pandemic has led to an economic depression. And though the pandemic and the economic depression have impacted everyone, they've been disproportionately impacting Black, Brown, and Native American families, children, and communities. We're also in a moment of widespread racial justice movements across the United States. They were sparked by the murder of George Floyd and the other murders of Black, Brown, and Native American men, women, and children. And I think when we're thinking about this moment in history, when we think about equity, we know that this stuff didn't just happen in 2020. There are disparities on how the pandemic and how our economy have impacted the well-being of our communities of children and families, and the disparities and disproportionate impacts on children and families of color across the United States is not a new phenomenon for 2020. What COVID has done and the subsequent economic impacts have really just surfaced deep and structural and institutional inequities in our society. We know that there are disparities in access and outcomes around early care and education, in wealth, there's wealth gaps. We know that there have been ongoing disparities in access to food, increased hunger and nutrition, access to health care and mental health care access, housing instability, policing, and safety. These are not new phenomenon. They've just been made more visible in 2020, given the pandemic and other circumstances. The pandemic has also had other impacts. The pandemic has really contributed to a near collapse of childcare in the United States due to closed schools and preschools. There's been a cost of over $700 billion in lost revenue and productivity. A recent NACE study estimates without federal support, 45% of Ohio's childcare slots could disappear. And 1 in 5 childcare jobs have been lost since February. Again, what we're saying is that the COVID and the time in history that we're in have exacerbated already existing systemic racial and economic inequalities for children and families. This is data, pre-pandemic data, showing that 1 in 4 young Ohio children lived below the poverty line, and that those shares are far higher for Black, multiracial, and Latinx children. But since the pandemic, those disparities have been further exacerbated. This is national data showing that since the pandemic, many US families with young children have reported increased material hardships. So they have been struggling since the pandemic to pay for things like utility or housing, emotional support, childcare, and et cetera. And you can see that those material hardships have increased dramatically for those Black and Latinx children. And it's gone down actually for some segments of white families. This is also data showing around food insecurity in Ohio since the pandemic, that food sufficiency among Ohio households with children has decreased. There's increased anxiety and decreased access to food and nutrition for Ohio's kids. We wanted to highlight and point out and share with you this wonderful resource provided by the National Black Child Development Institute, which really helps to drive home and offer additional information that shows that disparities really have existed prior to 2020. And we invite you to take a look at this resource. It'll be linked in the resource slides at the end of this presentation. But some of the data that they share is that Black infant mortality rate is 3 times as high as the white rate in Ohio. There's a 2 to 3 times higher maternal mortality rate. There's disparities in areas like expulsion and suspension for young children in Ohio. I think resources like this can offer the data and information that we need as a starting point to address these disparities and make visible these disparities within our early childhood, family, and community systems. We also know that Ohio's publicly funded childcare system sustains and reproduces race and place inequities. Black children are not accessing or don't have access to high quality environments at the same rate as white children. and there are place disparities as well as race disparities. So when you look across rural areas in Ohio, there's also disparities that are common around access and quality of childcare. Racial disparities also exist in wages for Ohio's early childhood workforce. This is a groundwork study that shows a difference in compensation, looking at early childhood educators. African-American educators, 84% of them are making less than $15 per hour, while a lower rate of 73% of white Hispanic educators are making less than $15 per hour. I think this also highlights, obviously, issues with compensation across the workforce, but even among a low compensated workforce, African Americans are paid less. Okay, so as leaders, and as leaders, we use data to tell the story of children and families and to make visible disparities in our early childhood systems. But we also look at the environment and what people and leaders are talking about. Ohio made headlines when leaders in several communities declared racism a public health crisis. Leaders can leverage these efforts and the visibility to disparities and systemic root causes of these disparities that these kind of efforts provide. So given kind of where we are and the environment and the visibility that disparities, the visibility of inequities in our systems that this moment in history has shown, can you use your Menti code, share one or two ways that COVID-19 has affected young children and families in Ohio? And we really, I think, we want to hear from, and one of our big themes as leaders for equity is we want to hear from as many different perspectives as possible. So we're excited to just be able to hear from and get a better sense from the 290 folks from across our Ohio's early childhood system that are currently here. We want to be able to, from your perspective, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in your communities? What are you seeing in your programs? What are you seeing with the children and families you're interacting with every day? And so we're seeing, we're seeing some depression. We're seeing changes in routine, some material hardships, not a consistent way to get food, separation from extended families. So we're seeing a lot of very impactful day-to-day barriers that COVID has drawn out, as well as ongoing systemic barriers that are amplified during this time. Okay. And then I'm going to move on to the next. Oh, here we go. Okay, so just in summary, what data and this information showed us really is that COVID had just made plain the brutal reality of child inequality due to race, social class, and place, and that all early childhood leaders and leadership, as among the 290 folks that are on this call and all the others we have influence and plan and lead with, have to be committed to racial equity, and that commitment is needed now to help rebuild early childhood systems so we don't reproduce these current systemic inequalities. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Aisha. I'm trying to forward it. Let me keep trying. There we go.
There we go. Great. Thank you very much, Michelle. And I want to thank, pardon me, everyone who commented on their why. There were some absolutely wonderful and inspiring comments that you made, and they ranged from providing children with a strong foundation, giving children a great start, helping children and the professionals who work with them to really be better readers, making up for things that some of you felt you did not have in your own childhoods, making sure that your young children you work with get those things that you know are important for their development. So we really thank you all for joining us in that answering that question. We're going to talk now about sort of why racial equity matters in early childhood and sort of underscore a set of issues because there are many reasons. One of the things that we have to understand when we're looking at racial inequities, racial marginalization, economic marginalization, is that we have to understand the ecology of this. Why, what are the factors that really contribute to sustaining this kind of marginalization? It has clearly been going on in the United States for an extremely long time. If you look at the way in which race became structured in the United States, which began in the 17th century when the first Africans in 1619 arrived as slaves, and when with the first European encounters with Native Americans who occupied all of this land before any of us got here, you'll understand that the dynamics between Europeans, indigenous people, and Black people on this continent is fraught with issues that lead us to the door of racial marginalization. What we have to understand is history, culture, and identity. All three of these pieces matter. We don't have sufficient time today to get into each of them. We want to understand what our responsibilities are and what we need to look at in order to understand really how marginalization operates. It operates through power and economics. Those are two of the key issues. We see political power and how it can decide where resources go and how it can withhold resources, how it can create policies that help and policies that hurt. We know that economics is a huge factor because we have a growing gap between very, very rich elites and the rest of Americans, and deeper and deeper poverty going on at the very bottom of the income distribution that is overwhelmingly Black, Brown, Native American, Asian American, and white poverty. Deeper white poverty than has been seen for a long time in this country. So though both the power and economics issues and how they work and function, and the history, culture, and identity interaction. Identity is a critical thing. If you think about all of what is going on in this latest election around issues of identity based on who belongs here, who can be included, who's a real American, et cetera. So those factors, not only do they live in the past, but they live with us in the present and continue to shape the inequalities and the unequalness that we see in early childhood. When we look at internal factors, it's bias, privilege, internalized racism that we have to consider, among others, but certainly those. And then we have to look at these things in terms of our personal development, our interpersonal relationships, the way these issues get expressed in institutions, and the structural components that hold this inequality together, laws, segregation, and other kinds of factors like that. So I'm going to move on from here, but this is a complicated issue, and I encourage you to look at a video called Cracking the Code. Cracking the Code. It's on YouTube. It's quite powerful in terms of its coverage, both of different voices around this issue of marginalization and racism in our society, but also explains a lot of the history and the impact on individuals as well. One important thing we think that every one of us has to understand is that children of color and children in poverty in this country really have a unique set of structural factors that shape their lives. These factors do not influence the lives of middle-class white children in the same way. These factors are social stratification, that is the creation of a category called race, and then the way in which the culture and the society have defined what race means. When you think about it, there is no white land from which white people came. That term is an American construction. The same is true of Black people. Black people came from multiple ethnic groups on the African continent, but when they came here, they were pushed into a single racial category. And the same has been true for every other group that has come here. If you come as Italians or Irish, you have to fit into the racial hierarchy of the United States. You have to become white. If you don't, then there are very few examples where people did not. Most people adopt the highest racial category if they can, that is whiteness, because it's the most powerful and brings you the most opportunities and rewards. But the binary, particularly the Black-white binary, has meant that Black people and other people of color who have come to this society along with Blacks and Native Americans have had to fit into this a racial category as well. Hence the creation of categories like Latinx and Asian American and so forth. Again, big meta categories in which all kinds of ethnicities are scrunched together, even though they may not actually see themselves as the society has now labeled them. So the social stratification issue is the first thing that shapes the lives of Black and Brown and Native American kids. The second is ideologies. You have to give people reasons to support inequality. And in the case of this society, of course, racism is a key ideology, xenophobia, misogyny, bias against those in poverty, all of these provide a justification for social stratification. We, for example, step over homeless people lying in the street because we may say, oh, well, they deserve to be poor. That's the way the ideology has acted on our understanding and thinking. And the third piece is segregation, so that resources like good schools and safe neighborhoods and housing are unevenly distributed and unavailable or less available to some compared to others. And for kids of color and children in poverty, their opportunity structures are very much shaped by segregation. We also know that it's important for us to bear in mind that it is not sufficient to simply talk about poverty. We usually get asked a question about, well, why don't we just address these issues through the doorway of poverty? Let's talk about income inequality, but let's not talk about race. It's too complicated, it's too difficult. This slide helps us understand why we have to talk about both race and poverty. If you look at the orange bar on the right side of the screen, that is the total number of children birth to 5 in Ohio by race and ethnicity and poverty. Now the orange bar shows all those children together in one, and represented in one percentage. 21% of all the kids, regardless of race or ethnicity, are poor in Ohio. But if we break out the data by race, what we see is that when you intersect race, ethnicity, and social class, you get these huge disparities in the experience of poverty. Asian and Pacific Islander children in Ohio, only 6% of them are in poverty. 14% of white children, 30% of children who are 2 or more races, 38% of Latinx kids, and 46% of Black children under the age of 6 are in poverty. These disparities are why we focus on racial equity. It is not a good thing for the state of Ohio that 21% of their kids are poor. It's not a good thing that 6% of Asian American children are poor, but it is a terrible thing that the percentages are so high for certain groups of children. We also know that zip codes matter, and the opportunities that children have are very much related to zip codes. If you look again at the right side of this slide, the opportunity structure not available to all children. This lists many of the features that are part of the good life for children in the United States. Employment, your parents have an adequate income, they have benefits, working conditions are good for them, and they may even have a retirement plan. They have environmental safety. Their neighborhoods are not next to brown zones. Those children are not exposed to toxic chemicals on a daily basis. They have good, what we call good health. They have low mortality at birth. Their mothers have low mortality, and so on and so forth. These aspects are what we want for every child, but every child does not get them. I grew up in a zip code in Chicago. My husband grew up in another zip code exactly 10 blocks away. He grew up in a zip code in which the community was highly resourced, middle class, et cetera. I grew up in a working class Black community where the schools were so overcrowded and so segregated that we went to school for half a day for about 4 years of my elementary education. So zip codes matter in terms of what children get out of the society. All people in the United States, or at least most people in the United States, pay taxes, but those taxes do not get returned to every community in a way that represents even a measure of equality. In rural zip codes, in suburban zip codes, and in urban zip codes, there are children who have access to opportunity structures that actually truncate their development. And if we look at this slide, whoops, it's not moving again. This is a very sluggish machine, and I do apologize to all of you. All right, let's see, going down. Well, if we get to the next, if we get to the next slide, you will see that the interlocking structures that create the inequality for young children, but these also represent the characteristics of the opportunities, pathways that poor children and children who are racially marginalized in this society experience. Wealth gaps, segregated communities, segregated poorly resourced schools, child welfare policies that disrupt families, employment structures that low wages for families, et cetera. So these kinds of differences for children, two different pathways, two different childhoods. One is one that really supports thriving children and families, the other does not. If someone can advance the slide, that would be lovely. I think I do not have whatever magic touch one needs to do this.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you. So in our work, we define racial equity in this way. Now we know that some people like shorter definitions. Racial equity is really when you achieve equality for children. But our definition speaks to specific things that we feel leaders and society in general have to be held accountable for. Every child and family, regardless of race, ethnicity, and social circumstances, has everything they need to develop optimally. Resources, opportunities, rewards, and burdens are fairly distributed across groups and communities so that those with the greatest challenges are adequately supported and not further disadvantaged. Policies designed to support children and families are fair and just, and the race rules, that is the interlocking structures, policies, practices, laws, customs, et cetera, that currently undergird inequality in early childhood are identified, dismantled, and rewritten so that race, ethnicity, language, place, gender, national origin do not negatively influence child and family outcomes. It's fair and just, rewards are and resources are distributed fairly. Children have everything they need to thrive. I apologize, we are not moving here. All right, so finally, let me just remind you that we know in this country what to do. We have a body of early childhood science that has laid out, not just for our country, but for many, many early childhood advocates around on the planet, that why early childhood is so important as a developmental period in terms of brain development, and what is required of environments, of caregivers, and of the society to support that brain development. It's not just in terms of early education, it's also in terms of early intervention, maternal and child health, income transfer programs that help to lift families out of poverty, and other strategies. Those things work. And when in our history, we have done better at developing and supporting those programs, we have seen a reduction in poverty and an improvement in child well-being and family well-being. So we know that the programs work, and that not just those programs do we need to work for, but we need to work for something bigger. Both the programs and the dismantling of the systems that have allowed these kinds of, the kind of marginalization we see. So it's both programs, but it's a larger lift that we all need to make. Again, I am trying to advance the slide and it's not going anywhere. Okay, so I'd like you to think about this. What is the most significant racial equity challenge you feel young children and families in Ohio face today? And so if you'd share that with us, we'd really appreciate it. And we will, great. And we will, I will sit here and take some notes on it, and Michelle will continue talking, and we'll refer back to it in a moment when I've gotten a sense of this.
All right. So do we have to, I'm trying to advance the slide and it's not letting me, so.
I'm trying to do it, but it's also not doing it. Oh,
there we go.
I don't know.
Julie is doing it.
Oh, thank you, Julia.
There we go. All right, thank you very much, Julia. Thank you, Aisha. All right, so I think, so leading for equity and building equitable systems does not happen by accident. And kind of the next section of our talk today is we really want to talk about how to lead for equity. What are those activities? What are those ways of thinking and doing our work within our own individual roles, authority, and areas of influence? What can we do to advance equity and to build equitable systems for Ohio's and our nation's youngest children and families? And so we like to think about it in kind of across 5 different processes or 5 different ways of building equitable systems. We say that there's a focus on leadership and leaders to have to do targeted strategies to achieve universal goals. We want all kids and families to be healthy and to be successful, but how do we think about targeted and tailored strategies to make that happen, given the disparities that exist in our system? We use data in planning, decision-making, and monitoring to identify and make visible disparities, as well as to continually look at the effectiveness of our strategies in advancing equity and child and family well-being. We focus on root causes of inequality and inequities in early childhood systems. The reason why there are inequalities, the reason why there are disparities are because we have to change some things in our systems. We have to shift how we think about resources. We have to shift planning. We have to tailor strategies. And so to do that, we really have to identify those root causes. We have to take action. We can have a lot of conversations about inequity and disparities across our early childhood systems, but if we're not willing or able to understand how to take action at all levels, and when we think about action, we talk about it at the personal level, the interpersonal level, the institutional level, and the structural level. We also want to know and need to know how we work with and listen to those individuals that programs and services are designed to serve. And it's amazing how many decisions happen at tables where nobody has talked to a family or a provider or have talked to the communities of which these programs and initiatives exist. Okay, so for this first section, we're going to focus on the commitment that leaders have to make to racial equitable systems, the data and how you use data and how you think about disaggregated data in this work, and targeted strategies to advance equity. So how do we lead for equity? What does that mean? So here are some ways to think about it. And we kind of call them equity leadership propositions. So to ensure racial and economic equity for young children, we have to increase opportunities for children, families, and communities, and for the adults who care for them. We have to remove barriers to opportunities, and we have to support optimal growth and development. And again, that's for children, families, and the workforce. We have to think about resources and burdens and make sure that rewards are distributed in a way that remove and do not exasperate inequities. We have to make sure that our systems are developed in a way that children and families are not further disadvantaged by the decisions and the policy and practice that we're making. We have to ensure that there's assessment mechanisms in place, again, to determine who's advantaged and disadvantaged by those initiatives, policies, practices, and that we are dismantling inequities and not just adding to them or keeping them sustained. So all of us on this call are early childhood leaders, and we all have roles and responsibilities in the areas of influence. And we all, in order to move our systems ahead, to build equity in our systems, to assure that our systems are equitable, we all have to take action. And we all have to think about what that action means within our role, within our individual roles and responsibilities in areas of influence. Racial equity is a whole system issue. It's all of us. It's not just folks sitting in early learning. It's not just those at the Capitol making decisions. It's all of us involved with the systems and across our systems. It's our folks in health. It's our folks in mental health. It's our folks in family support. It's a whole system issue. And one of the ways that we lead for equity is we think about and use data. I'm a data person. I'll look at data all day, all the time if I can. And data is such a foundational way that we need to think about and think about how we look at data, what data we collect, and how we use it at every step of our process as being leaders for equity. Early childhood system leaders use disaggregated data to reveal the complexities of disparities, to uncover hidden disparities in access and outcomes, and to see disproportionality more clearly. Aisha talked about earlier in our talk today about why do we not just focus on poverty? The reason we don't just focus on poverty, part of the reason is because we look at the data and we understand that there's disproportionality within those in poverty in this country, and what does that mean? And how does that impact our tailored response to assure equity in our early childhood systems and then dismantle the inequities that we're seeing. So we start with what we know about kids and families, and that typically comes through data. It can come through spreadsheet data or data in charts like described here. Data is also what we're hearing from our families and communities. It's the voice of children, it's the voice of families, it's the voice of the workforce. So we also, as leaders for equity, we have to assure that we are doing targeted and tailored strategies. We focus on universal, we have a universal goal. All of us want a society where all children have loving, responsive, and consistent caregivers in the first 3 years of life to support optimal brain development, early learning, health, and well-being. That would be an example of a universal goal. We want that for all children. But we also understand and we use data to identify targeted strategies and tailored responses. So a targeted strategy, for example, would be home visiting. That's a targeted strategy to meet a universal goal. I think when we sit and when we talk about what we want our early childhood systems to do, we talk universally. We talk about universal goals. To build equity and to build a system and to be leaders for equity, we have to think about targeted strategies. We have to think about tailored responses. So again, we are all leaders, and equity leaders in early childhood systems must take action for racial equitable systems, no matter where we are in the system, and think about our authority or influence and what role we have to play. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. Okay, so in our work, think about what you're responsible for and what decisions that you're making. Are you designing and implementing initiatives and programs? Are you developing policies? Are you determining how resources are distributed? Are you analyzing, monitoring data? Are you assessing the impact of those strategies? Are you engaging individuals who work in those systems? Are you recommending ideas and innovations for program delivery? Are you overseeing policies and practice? Are you doing hiring and promotion, et cetera? So there are a lot of opportunities, and there's opportunities every day in every decision that we make as leaders, no matter where we are in the system, to move ahead and to build equity into our systems and to assure that all kids and families get the opportunities in our systems, and we can overcome disparities through building and using our authority and where we sit in the system to build those systems and address equity. Oops, sorry, got distracted. All right, Aisha, taking the next section.
So Michelle, you have apparently the power to advance the slides, so I would love it if you would advance.
I will.
Right now. So of the 5 things that Michelle mentioned that early childhood system leaders for racial equity do, an additional 2 are they focus on the root causes of inequality, and they focus on 4 levels of change. And here are 2 of these levels. The structural level, which I mentioned earlier, which has to do with really arrangements that are interconnected and really resist change. This is a very difficult level to change unless you are going to the state legislature to have new laws enacted, new regulations enacted, new policies enacted, and the dismantling of policies that have been problematic. But it still is an important thing for leaders to think about what is going on at the structural level, because so much of what is going on, which is often quite invisible to us, is what is sustaining the racial inequities in a very powerful way. But there are sustaining actions at every one of these levels, and I'm going to talk about each of them. This is the structural, the other is the institutional. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the personal, and then talk about the interpersonal in relation to developing transformative relationships with communities and families. The institutional is one where actually early childhood leaders have can make a much bigger impact. This has to do with changing policies, practices, regulations, and the work culture to dismantle those that perpetuate inequality and design and develop policies and practices that advance opportunities, fairness, access to resources, and other factors for those individuals most affected by racial and economic inequality. This is where we believe that leaders really can make a difference. Next slide, Michelle. We know from a body of work that has been done around the impact of policies that, in fact, there are ways to design policies that really are effective. And so equity leaders, when they are focused on rooting out the causes of structural and institutional inequality and trying to build culturally, linguistically, racially, and ability inclusive systems, they really are trying to address fundamental issues that are central to the problems we see in early childhood. Next slide, please. Racial equity leaders are aware of studies like this one, which was done by the Roosevelt Institute. The citation for it is there in the corner. I would highly recommend this study called Rewrite the Racial Rules. It looks particularly at about 8 different areas of policy, employment policy, education policy, and so forth, and makes the argument that the reason why that policies that have been directed at addressing racial disparities and income and other outcomes fail often or don't succeed as far as they should One, because structural institutional factors like laws, policies, customs, and ideologies continue to benefit some and not others. Secondly, that the explanations for inequality stress individual choice and cultures of poverty, rather than why race structures and influences outcomes. You hear this, we hear this very often, that people explain what's going on in terms of the presence and permanence of inequality in terms of the fact that people make bad moral choices. The reality is that people may make bad choices, that's true, but if you have a system that is structured in such a way that it reinforces inequality in many, many levels and systems, whether you're making bad choices or good choices is kind of irrelevant. The system itself is creating opportunities or not creating opportunities for you. And that is the real crux of the problem. A third thing that this study found is that the consequences of disinvestment over time on individuals and communities of color are not sufficiently part of policy development and assessment. Across this country, there are communities of color, Black, Brown, Native American, Asian American, in which system-wide disinvestment in those communities has occurred. This is particularly a problem for Black communities. And these communities have been hollowed out. They are deeply impoverished economically and in terms of resources. And there, so far, has been few responses to trying to fix these problems. But these problems, this issue, is at the heart of much of what we see. And it refers to this kind of structural marginalization that we see. And the fourth thing that the study found is that the focus on accountability, there's a focus rather on accountability and not a capacity building across the workforce to begin to change the policies and practices, laws and customs of the society. Next slide, please. What we see in early childhood is a whole range of institutional and structural factors that perpetuate the disparities. And I know many of you are familiar with these, and so I'm certainly not going to read all of them, but we know that there's problems of alignment, of access, of policies like expulsion policies that have been risen up by great research from Yale and other places to point out the disparities that are going on in early childhood programs. Professional development is unavailable to many people, high quality professional development, but even professional development is just not sufficiently available to the entire early childhood workforce. Funding is unstable and so on and so forth. And so here, there are more of these, including problems with implicit bias training and preparation, even awareness of it as a really important factor, the scarcity of caregivers, teachers, and other staff who share the children's culture, race, ethnicity, and language. And of course, the big kahuna of our field, wages and compensation of the workforce, is simply inadequate. All of those problems are structural and institutional, and all of them can be targets for the work that you do. The third level here that we want to raise to your consciousness and awareness is the personal level of change. And this often gets a lot of attention because of the implicit bias work. But there's more work to be done than simply focusing on implicit bias. And the work has to be ongoing, and it has to be done in such a way that we really have individuals working in our field who are able to, alone and with others, to understand their own values, beliefs, implicit biases, unconscious racism, actions, and relative privileges that contribute to racial inequities and economic injustice. Each of us in our own individual acts, of course, can advance racial justice and racial equity, but we also can sometimes just derail it, and we really need to do personal work. And this is a lifelong commitment that we have to make to this. Next slide, please. We know that implicit bias is something that lives in all of us and in every human being, in fact. Pardon me. We know that about 2% of our implicit biases we're aware of, but about 98% of them we are unaware of. And we know that it is possible to help people understand what they are and to actually begin to unlearn them. but it cannot be done by simply doing a couple of trainings on implicit bias. It's a much longer process, but it is an important thing for us to think about how to make that a priority within our work. Next slide. Part of the reason it's so important to think about implicit bias is because of the kind of work done by Bonilla Silva, who is a researcher at Duke University. He and others like him have done really, I think, incredibly important work looking at what goes on within our kind of thinking about racism. We now have a society in which most people will not say they are a racist, but they hold ideas that suggest that they try to minimize or ignore or make light of racial disparities. And what he has uncovered in his work, and quite extensive work on how particularly white students and white adults that he works with think about race and racism, he found 4 frames that people use to explain away or justify the circumstances they see before them that look to many of us like racial disparities and marginalization, but not necessarily to all of us. One of the frames is minimizing or denying the existence of ongoing racial disparities, to simply say they don't exist. The second is to blame the existence of disparities when they are acknowledged on pathologies in non-white groups and communities rather than on structural factors that privilege whites. If you see individuals say, well, the reason people are treated the way they are treated differently is because their morals are bad, or they won't go to work, or they have children too young, or whatever is the explanation. Those moral failings are the reason that we see the disparities, not structural issues in the minds of those individuals who use these. The third is asserting that factors central to racial privilege and racism, such as segregation, are merely normal reflections of each group's natural preference to be with their own kind. The reason Blacks all live in Blacks in Cleveland may live in neighborhoods that are on one side of the city and not others is simply because Black people want to live together, not because there are housing restrictions, mortgage issues, issues of taxation, the acts of real estate agents that limit where Blacks can live. And fourth, supporting the ideals of equality and meritocracy while refusing to recognize that the playing field is not level for all in this society. What he also identifies is that people don't just use one of these, they use multiple ones of these in their conversations. So it's important for us to both understand implicit bias, but also how when we hear these kinds of arguments, what we are actually hearing and why we are hearing it. Now to move on, I'd like to focus for a minute on the 5th element that we feel is important for leaders in early childhood to focus on, and that is the interpersonal level of change. This is a really important topic, we think, because it is one of these areas where early childhood systems leaders, early childhood leaders who are providers, early childhood leaders who direct programs, early childhood leaders who do early intervention, all of us can engage and can try to build these kinds of transformational relationships with families and community leaders, particularly families and community leaders furthest from opportunity. In interpersonal level work, the individual works together with others, such as parents and guardians, community leaders, not like themselves, but actively including those individuals typically excluded. And those early childhood leaders are willing to share power, able to surface issues of racial and economic inequality in interpersonal relationships, actively supportive of change, and working to reduce interpersonal conflict and to increase inclusion and understanding between groups and individuals. We think this is a strength-based action that individuals take. It is one that pushes us to think about whether or not We hold deficit perspectives on the groups and communities we wish to work with and reach out to, but it is one that we feel requires that leaders recognize the strengths that communities have. Next slide, please. We know that when leaders work with, listen to, and get to know communities they serve, it helps them to see these assets that communities have versus deficits. We know that it helps them to listen to community voices and the stories people tell about their lives and experiences they are having, and to develop a much deeper appreciation of those things. We know that learning about history and the agency and the cultures of communities is very important. If we see people who live, for example, with low wealth, with low income, and see them as just dependent and passive, we really are generally, in my experience at least, missing a critical factor. Many, many, many communities have organized for their own self-determination, for their own rights. I mean, the racial justice movement we see going on in the country today, and even this morning after the murder of Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia, these things are happening because people are organized, and there's a long, long history of organization across Native American groups, Black groups, Latinx groups, Asian American groups, and others for their rights. And so it's important for us not to think that people are just beaten down by oppression. Communities can organize and have organized for their own rights and liberties. We also think that to know families is to help leaders understand, what do they really want from leaders? What are their goals and aspirations for their children and their families and their communities? And to really appreciate and seek community knowledge. And it's important for leaders also to involve families and community members and community leaders in developing, evaluating, and monitoring services and programs that they are providing to understand, are they working? Are they really helping people or not? Next slide, please. Early childhood leaders can use evidence-based research to understand why these policies often don't work, as I mentioned earlier. And two of the big issues are that the exclusion of those people most affected is one of the problems as to why they are seen as not being able to always be as effective as they should. If people are involved from the beginning in planning, evaluating, reframing of policies, thinking them through, perhaps what we will see is that these policies and programs will be tailored more to what communities need and want than what people who do not live in those communities and who may not visit them often feel they need and want. And secondly, the consequences of disinvestment help us understand more deeply the impact of that on communities. We know that and feel very strongly that transformational engagement matters when building equitable systems. Communities are experts on children, families, and the community's strengths and needs. The interpretation of data and root causes of disparities done with community members is a very different conversation, in my experience, than it is when it's done simply by early childhood system leaders in a downtown office, which I have observed on a number of occasions. The impact of policies, programs, and systems and structures on the lives of individuals come alive for the leader. In addition, it helps leaders build trust, which is a currency that's very precious, between communities and organizations. So if you're working with communities that have experienced this kind of long-term disinvestment, there will be distrust of early childhood system leaders in some of those communities, maybe all of them. And it is important to build and nurture trust with groups. Listening to and working with community leaders is essential equity work. The phrase, "nothing about us without us," which is an expression which I think sums up really this whole issue of involvement, deeper involvement of community voices in what we do in early childhood, is really important. And we need to really think about this transformational engagement as something that is frequent and bidirectional. And we're going to look at the next slide. This was particularly helpful for us to think about in this period of COVID. If you look at the right-hand column, this describes the characteristic of transformational community engagement. It's co-constructed between early childhood systems leaders and community leaders. The communication pattern is bidirectional, equally bidirectional. Each can reach out to the other and be heard. Interaction is frequent, trust is relational, learning is shared, control is shared, and benefits are shared. So each group gets what it needs out of this relationship. If you look to the left-hand column, to the transactional community engagement model, which is, from our experience, again, what most leaders we have talked to in early childhood systems across the country, most of them say the relationships are transactional. And so those kinds of transactional relationships, the early childhood system, the ECS, to community engagement, to community is the communication pattern. So it's ECS to community, not so much community back to ECS. The interaction is occasional, the trust is limited, learning mostly benefits ECS, control is in ECS's hands, and the benefits are specific to the early childhood system. And there is a transitional way in between these two. But we are hoping to encourage you to think about and work for, if you aren't doing it already, this kind of transformational kind of structure. So our last question for this morning is the question that Michelle has put up. Would you share one or two successes you have experienced in developing your own leadership to build transformational engagement with community leaders and families? Now I'm going to hand this back to Michelle after I ask you to think about one last thing. Next slide. Next slide, not going. Okay, we can go to, we can move on, Michelle.
Yeah, he's working on it. Oh, there
okay.
she is.
Why don't we go to your next, the last, okay. All right. Do you want to, I think these questions have been pretty much raised, so let's go past this to your section and see if we have a few minutes at the end for any questions that the audience has. If you have questions that you would like us to think about.
Thanks, Aisha. We have some takeaways, and I think these will be pretty clear, and they should sound really familiar throughout our presentation this morning. But really our takeaways are, so in your current role, responsibilities and influence, you can act for racial equity and family well-being for Ohio's children. You can do that by focusing on leaders and leadership, focusing on root causes, using data. You can target, as Aisha talked about, the 4 levels of change: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And you should, as a leader, you can understand who you're working with and listen to those individuals in those programs and those systems. When we think about this work, we really don't view racial equity as a noun. It's not something, it is something you do. There has to be action related to it at every phase of the work. And it's a goal and it's a process. It is part of a racial justice approach to the marginalization of young children, families, and communities in state systems, and to address that marginalization. Racialization and othering and marginalization have historic roots. This didn't happen today, it currently shapes the lives of children, young Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander children in poverty in rural and urban communities today. So now is when we have to change, and now is when we have to tailor strategies to address it and to build equity into our systems and to build equitable systems. We also have to reimagine an inclusive and racially equitable early childhood system in Ohio, in which race, place, class, citizenship status, gender, and other factors no longer disproportionately influence child, family, community, and workforce well-being. And we have to take actions to make that happen in Ohio. Ultimately, that's the goal. That's what we want. That's what we want the systems to look like. And that's what we need to work together to achieve. All right, so it is, let's see, it's 10:25. So we want to see if we have a few minutes, if any questions came up that Lynanne and her team would like us to address. And then I know that Lynanne has some wrap-up comments as well. But thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Ray and Michelle. I don't see any questions in the Q&A format, but if they come up as I'm wrapping up, please, we can address them if we have time. And if not, we're happy to follow up offline. So thank you again, Dr. Ray and Michelle and the entire BUILD team for your time and expertise. And thank you to the participants for learning with us. I think, you know, whether or not you've participated in any type of equity training, there's always more to learn and opportunities to dig deeper. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we really view this training as a beginning for us and for all of you on the phone. So before we wrap up, I want to share a few next steps or action steps. And the first is regarding continuing education credit if you participated in the training today. So you will receive a follow-up email in the next few hours that will include the recorded webinar, a copy of the slides used today, and the resources and additional links that were referenced during the training. Many of you have asked for that. They will come to you. There will also be a link in that email to a follow-up survey. And this is to help inform our work moving forward and informing our partners on the ways to best support you in advancing equity in your programs and communities. If you are participating in today's training for professional development or continuing education credits, when you registered, if you're a child care professional or an early childhood educator, we already have your OPIN number. So no worries, we have your OPIN number from your registration. But in order to receive credit, whether you're a child care professional or you are receiving credit through the National Association of Social Workers, the Ohio chapter, or the Department of Developmental Disabilities as an early intervention provider, you need to fill out the follow-up survey. So the follow-up survey is mandatory in order to receive your credit. So please keep a lookout for that email today. And I promise you it will be short, but we really value your feedback and need that in order to ensure that you get credit. So we want to say if you're interested in learning more about Groundwork Ohio's equity-focused work over the last few years and how we're acting on our learnings moving forward, I encourage you to take a look at our newest report, Drafting a New Blueprint for Success, Reflections on Ohio Early Childhood Race and Rural Equity, that was released in September. There's a link in the chat box to that. And again, you'll get it in your follow-up email. Next, you may have some thoughts about how you may act on what you've learned in today's training. And as you do so, we would ask and encourage you to also participate in an advocacy campaign that we're hosting to declare racism as a public health crisis in the state of Ohio and across the nation. So by clicking the link in the chat box, again, you'll get this additionally in the follow-up email. Within 2 to 3 minutes, you can contact and send a message to your state legislators and congressional delegates. The messages utilize email, social media, and phone calls to ask them to declare that racism is a public health crisis in the state and in the nation. There are currently resolutions pending in both the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate and in Congress to do so. And we are urging policymakers to take action on these resolutions. So to have additional hearings, to hear testimony from community members like you about your experience with racism, and also then to ultimately pass these resolutions and recognize the impact of racism in the state and in the nation. The last opportunity I want to share with you is that if you're interested in engaging further with us, you should absolutely consider applying for the 2021 cohort of the Groundwork Ohio Early Childhood Leadership Fellowship. Applications are open through November 20th. And you can visit the link in the chat box. Again, we'll provide it additionally via email if you would like to apply or look more into what that leadership program is all about. So once again, thank you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll leave my email in the chat box now. So if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, otherwise for any of us at Groundwork, that can get directly to me. And if you don't have the, if we don't have the answer, we'll do our best to connect you to one of our partners or someone else who does. So please take care, stay safe, and enjoy your day. Thanks for joining us.